Hello, I'm Joel Podolny, Dean of the Yale School of Management and one of the faculty who's been involved in the design of the Faith and Globalization seminar at Yale University. I'm pleased to have with me here John Thornton. John is a professor at Tsinghua University. He is the chair of the Brookings Institution Board, and he is the former chief operating officer of Goldman Sachs. John, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Good morning.
John, as you know, one of the central themes of the seminar is the relationship between faith, spirituality, and religion on the one hand, and economic development on the other. And a country that is a very interesting case study in that context is the country of China, a country both through your work, through your teaching, and through your extensive efforts to actually bring the United States on the one hand and China closer together, you certainly know a lot about. I'd like to just begin with sort of open-ended question and ask, given what you know of the political leadership in China today, how do you think they are thinking about the relationship between religion and spirituality on the one hand and their country's economic development on the other?
Well, I think we have to answer any question on China in an overall context and remind ourselves of at least two things. Number one, as an external observer, I always feel a great sense of humility, trying to get my mind around exactly what the Chinese leadership thinks and exactly what the Chinese culture permits or encourages. So with that strong caveat, I'd also like to put it in context the overall economic growth. So for 30 years, China's been growing at 9-10% a year, never before achieved in history. And the economy needs to grow at 7% per year just to create sufficient jobs for the new entrants into the workforce. Therefore, there's kind of a red line at 7% that the leadership clearly doesn't want the country to go below. Now, because of the history of China, which is to say periods of calm followed by periods of violence, and because of the recent history of China, particularly the Cultural Revolution, and the current leadership very aware of that, many of them having lived through it in rather dramatic ways, I would say priority number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for the leadership is stability. Now, within the context of stability, and very related to stability, is the issue of economic growth. However, as the country moves forward and as more people come out of poverty and as more people experience a new level of economic existence, it's both natural, and in fact I see it in my students at Tsinghua, a desire to ask the question, well, wait a minute, what is my life all about? What is it I'm trying to do? Why am I doing this? And searching for a deeper meaning to their existence. Now, and I think that's kind of organically going on in the minds of most people. And I think, therefore, there's a kind of unspoken void of sorts that needs to be filled. And I think the Chinese leadership is aware of that. Most recently, you may have seen that the president of China, the current president, Hu Jintao, has been a proponent of the so-called harmonious society. This is a term of art that the Chinese leadership uses as a kind of, I would say, a kind of aspiration, as well as a sort of working hypothesis. Now, it's intentionally left vague as to what it means so that you and I can put our own meaning into it. I personally think it has quite self-conscious Confucian overtones to it, that it reaches back to the notion of harmony as Confucius understood that word. Hu Jintao has never said that. That's my own interpretation. And I think it's also a sort of it's a concept that can apply to the very poor rural farmer, where in effect you're saying to that person, your principal or a principal purpose as a member of this culture, the Chinese culture, should be to contribute to the overall harmony of the society. And therefore, you should be doing nothing that would contribute to disharmony. And on the other side, if you're the young 35-year-old, by Chinese standards, very wealthy entrepreneur, it says to you, you have an obligation or a responsibility to contribute to the harmony of society. And anything you do that's disharmonious is not in keeping with the culture. And therefore, you should be behaving in a way that is not ostentatious, that is not exacerbating the differences between the rich and the poor. As I'm sure you know, China now has a disparity in rich and poor that's very much like the United States. And this is clearly a problem. So with that overarching theme, and I think also a clear evolution towards increasing amounts of personal liberty, and with the official recognition of religion by the Communist Party and by the leadership, I think what you're seeing as a general matter is an increased willingness on the part of the leadership to allow religions and or spiritual people to, I wouldn't use the word flourish, but I would say to be part of the building of a more pluralistic society. And however, going back to rule number one, that the first 5 priorities are stability, 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 and having regard to the harmonious society notion, it would say that you must conduct yourself in a way that doesn't threaten stability and is harmonious. Those two things presumably being, if not synonymous, very consistent. And therefore, as a kind of matter of prudent advice, as an individual, I think you'd be smart to keep your spirituality as a private matter, which is why you've seen from time to time when movements have arisen, like Falun Gong, which, and I'm not a Falun Gong expert by any means, but I think most proponents of Falun Gong would see it as a sort of spiritual movement. When one day thousands of members of the movement showed up in front of Zhongnanhai, the central leadership compound, that was seen as some kind of potentially organized group that could in some sense threaten the Communist Party, and therefore was shut down pretty severely. So the trend is pretty clear. Now, on the other hand, I wouldn't from that necessarily jump to any particular conclusion. If you go back into Chinese history, you'll know that Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, Christianity have all played their part in Chinese history, some more than others, and some I think would be regarded now as more indigenous than others. And the vast majority of the Chinese people, I think, would see themselves as, if they saw themselves as spiritual, it would be in some sense different than or distinctive from what we in the West would regard as spiritual. And so I'm reluctant to take this general trend towards increasing personal liberty and say, therefore, it is likely that
spirituality will merge the way it has in the West.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
There's a number of themes in what you just said, so let me sort of pick up on those themes and ask you about each of them. The first is this trend that you've noticed in your students, this and in society more broadly, this desire to find meaning. The second is the concern with stability on the part of political leadership, and the fact that spirituality seems like it could simultaneously fulfill both. And then the third is a distinction that comes out of what you've just said, and a distinction that it sounds like the political leadership, even if they haven't articulated it this way, are probably sensitive to, which is the distinction between spirituality on the one hand and then an organized religious movement on the other. And then the fourth is the fact that spirituality seems to have, and the way in which it's starting to arise may have some reflection of what we see in Western countries, doesn't necessarily mean that that's where one should assume it should go because they have a different history. So if I take those four pieces, and I'll ask you about each. First, this search for meaning that you're seeing in your students. Do you see that as being driven more strongly because of the economic changes, or has it always been there and they're now being allowed to reflect on it or think about it in light of the other forms of liberalization that are going on in the country?
I don't truly know the answer, but my intuition is this, that most of my students are young. When I say young, average age is mid to late 30s. So I have students who are 18 and I have students who are 45 and everything in between. So most of my students have, by definition, because they're at Tsinghua, they've done very well on their examinations, national examinations. They've gotten to Tsinghua one way or another. They're successful in the society, and they probably have some kind of job, either they've just come from or going to, or they're still in, which is some kind of high-level job of one sort or another. So it's a particular, let's call this group the people who are clearly benefiting right now from the economic progress in China. So my intuition is that that as they have succeeded, and maybe in particular my class, because my class encourages this question, encourages the question of where are you going and how are you getting there and why are you doing this? I think they've simply started to realize that almost as a matter of responsibility, both a personal responsibility and a societal responsibility, they should have a kind of worldview and how they fit into that worldview. And they should understand very carefully who are they, what motivates them, what are they trying to achieve and why. And in answering all of those questions, I think you inevitably get to the most fundamental question, which is, what does it mean to be a human being?
Why are any of us?
Yeah, in the 21st century in particular. And I think also this is probably brought into sharp focus because if you step back yet again and you ask yourself, where's the 21st century going? And just to take one example, if China continues to go down the development path that it's going down now, let's call that the Western development path. The best numbers I've seen show that China, within 20 years, let's say around 2030, something like that, the per capita income on a purchasing power basis will be the equivalent of the per capita income in the United States today. So if that were the case, and the Chinese, let's say, broadly speaking, behaved as Americans did, or Western developed countries did, then for every 4 people you'd have 3 automobiles, which means you'd have 1.1 billion automobiles. Today in the world we have 800 million in total. China would be consuming 100 million barrels of oil a day. Today in the entire world we produce maybe 90 million barrels a day. So this one country, China, in almost every feature and dimension would be consuming more than the whole world does today. Now, if you follow that logic and you then throw in what India might be doing, or Brazil, or Russia, or Indonesia, let alone where the United States develops in Western Europe, you quickly come to a view that this doesn't work. And therefore, you need some kind of new model, which the Chinese leadership is conscious of. And so when you go down that path and you say, what does that new model mean? What does it look like? I think you quickly come to the question, what does it mean to be a fulfilled or a successful person? Does it mean, is it a consumer society? You know, I was reading a bit of American history the other day in the 17th, 18th century, and noted that around that time, the leaders in this country told people or encouraged people to think that consuming was in and of itself a social good. And to this day, American policymakers will tell the Chinese, you need to get your people to consume more. If you would do that, it would be good for the world economy, which undoubtedly is correct. But it does beg the question, where is it written that consumption is ipso facto a good thing? And where's the balance here between what you consume and how you consume it, and how it's manufactured, and so forth? So it seems pretty clear that a new model is going to have to evolve. Now, that new model, in my own mind, isn't just for China. It's going to have to be for the rest of us. And that's going to be quite dramatic change. So in that context, going back to the question of spirituality, I think you do come full circle, because you start to think harder and sort of redefine or put different emphasis on what it means to, what a fulfilling life looks like. It's not simply, it's certainly not just a materialistic end. And at the moment, that's where the Chinese society seems to be heading. And if it's not just a materialistic end, then what is it? And what is it that gives people deeper satisfaction?
So in the U.S., the sources of those models would be religious leaders. They might be people who we'd put broadly under the rubric of social entrepreneurs, developing a model, creating a constituency for that model, and then trying to get that model into the public sphere for dialogue, debate, and hopefully, at least for that entrepreneur, it would spread. How's that happen in China? I mean, when I go back to what you were saying about the harmonious society, it sounds like this is a dialogue that takes place within the leadership that sort of gets tried out, and they wait for reaction and see how it plays out, modify based on that reaction. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think the Chinese leadership for some time have had this notion of sort of what I'll call big ideas that every so often get put out. And initially when they're put out, they are relatively ill-defined. And there's kind of an unspoken conversation that goes on. And sometimes that conversation is very vivid and very animated and very energetic, and you can see it and hear it. And sometimes it's more subtle than that. But the conversation takes shape over time, and then the leadership sort of refines the concept, or the concept becomes in effect collectively refined. So for example, just a few years ago, the Chinese leadership referred to China's peaceful rise, which was another kind of term of art. And as that particular term was debated among intellectuals in particular, both intellectuals on the left and the right disliked it, because on the one hand, the ones on the left said, rise, peaceful rise. Why are we using a term like that, which might circumscribe our ability to behave in foreign policy terms? It might, in effect, be a form of unilateral disarmament. And you had intellectuals on the right saying, this word rise is too threatening. We shouldn't use this word rise. So eventually, peaceful rise morphed into peaceful development. And now that term of art still exists. So with harmonious society, I think when it was first put out there, many people were sort of somewhere between, particularly Westerners, I would say, were sort of dismissive of it. This is kind of a form of propaganda, doesn't mean anything, etc. I think actually, as it's lived on, it's taken on greater force, because as I said a minute ago, I do think there's increasing clarity of understanding that simply going down the Western road won't be enough. But there's a tension, because the Chinese have lifted, depending on the numbers, somewhere between 250 to 400 million people out of poverty in essentially 30 years, which is quite an extraordinary achievement. And virtually everyone in the country will know someone, his son or daughter or aunt or uncle or somebody, has done very well. And so, therefore, the hundreds of millions who have not yet been pulled out of poverty are sort of hoping and assuming they will be pulled out of poverty. And so the Chinese leadership have got to deliver on that. But on the other hand, they've got to deliver on it in a way that's good for the overall, which is a very, very tough task, which also circles back to why stability is so important, because they say to themselves, it's absolutely essential that we have stability in order to give us the luxuries or the room to maneuver so that we can make some of these trade-offs that we're going to have to make in a way that works.
So if you had been teaching your class in the U.S. and you had been asking your students to sort of question, what's their purpose, why are they there, what do they want to achieve, you would be, I assume, expecting, hoping, wanting that the students would be sort of looking out to the many sources to help guide them through that answer. In China, how important is it that the leadership work through the model for your students to be able to come up with an answer that they feel comfortable about?
Well, let me give you two thoughts on that, both my students and also the ordinary people. Mm-hmm. Let me start with the second first. There is a woman professor, she's actually a professor of media at a Chinese university, who did her master's degree on Confucius. And in the past 2 years, she's gone on television, sort of a kind of a Chinese equivalent of a form of Oprah Winfrey, let's say. She's on television talking to ordinary people about Confucius and the relevance of Confucius to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. It's sort of Confucius for the masses. And she's also put out a book. And the book has sold 10 million copies that have been acquired, or been bought, and 10 million that have been pirated. It's the best-selling book in China. Now, that tells you something. It tells you, I think, that ordinary people are looking for someone to come along and give them a framework of some kind that helps put their life into some larger context. Now, for my students, who are, by definition, part of the elite, I think it's much more complex because they have access to and they are hungry for information from all over the world. Almost all of my students are good English speakers. Most, if not all, have traveled quite extensively or have traveled quite extensively. They are inveterate users of the internet. So they're looking all over the place. And I think that kind of exuberant or energetic experimentation is going to continue for a while. And therefore, what the Chinese leadership says is only, it's relevant
now
because
focus on the last set of things that you were talking about, which was
defines parameters.
As opposed to the focus and the clear concern and the clear belief in the value of spirituality and having a model of self that gives meaning.
Very, very hungry for those other
There's much more concern about organized religion, and again, for the exact same reason, about its concern because of the potential impact that it can have on stability. I mean, if I put those two together, it sounds in some sense like in China the evolution of people's spiritual selves will be based more on this country-level dialogue than on any actual action. I mean, if I can be a little bit self-deprecating, I mean, it sounds kind of like an academic's paradise, right? I mean, it's sort of like we'll just sort of keep talking, and when we get it, as opposed to you need to build churches, you need to build organizations, you've got to think about, what do you have to have in place in terms of interest? I mean, is that accurate?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say, I'm sure, and I just don't know enough about this, but I'm sure there are individuals who have in their mind what might be called a conventional model, and they're involved with a specific church, and that church is building itself out across the country and so on. I'm sure there is some of that going on, but I would say in all my time in China, very rarely do you run across someone, unless you seek that person out, who in the ordinary course of talking with you, or even in a more detailed, in-depth conversation that I might have with a student as I'm mentoring him or her, very rarely will they come straight out and say, I'm a committed Christian and I'd like to talk to you about that. Now, there are some like that. I have one student, for example, whose parents were in the government, he was in the government, And he literally says that he was walking down Park Avenue one day in the early 90s, and he had a revelation. And right there on the spot, he decided to leave his government job. He went back to China. He left his job, and he started a business which manufactures Christmas trees, electronic Christmas trees, which he sells through Walmart to make enough money to come back and go to Yale Law School to study constitutional law, to return to China, to have an impact on the development of the rule of law. But that's one student out of, let's say, 500 I've taught in the last 6 years. Now, there are, I say, a fair number of students or friends who are Buddhists of one sort or another. When I say one sort or another, I mean varying degrees of spirituality as distinct from kind of an ethical framework which is part of their makeup. But even there, this is not a topic that they would typically volunteer. This is a topic that you might get into because you sought it out. So, and I think part of this is just cultural. That cultural in the sense that the Chinese culture isn't the kind of culture where that topic would be volunteer as it might be in certain other cultures. And part of it cultural meaning the society is developing. And so what's permissible and what sort of convention is evolving. And so I think it's correct. If I had to kind of prognosticate, I would guess that there'll be another quite a few years while this conversation we've been describing is taking place, while at the same time certain things are happening within organized religion, which is probably in some sense reinforcing that conversation or feeding into the conversation. And a lot will depend on how those organized religions conduct themselves. Do they? I mean, you could, if you wanted to be expansive, you might even say that the strict separation of church and state might evolve for a very different reason in China as it did here, and what's permissible in the public square, and in what form and how organized is it. And I think just to make one other footnote, you've also seen the Chinese leadership, I think, try harder in dealing with organized religions such as the Catholic Church in trying to come to some kind of accommodation. I'm sure you know that there's been a kind of free zone between the Chinese and the Catholic Church for a long time, which has started to thaw. And I think the Chinese in general have taken the view that it's in China's interest to engage in dialogue and reach some kind of harmonious state, whether that's with other state actors or other institutional actors. And there are only a couple of issues that are kind of sort of non-negotiable or no-go areas where their view is crystal clear and it's black and white and can't be transgressed. But other than those few issues, their general operating philosophy has been to reach out to people and institutions and states in order to create the conditions under which they can govern the society, which is itself such a complex task that they can't afford the distraction, in effect, of disharmonious relations with anybody.
Okay. So one last question. You and I have talked before about China. One of the things that you have commented on is the very long time horizon that the Chinese leadership have. For those who would be observing China or would be interested in the way in which the dynamics around spirituality and religion would unfold, what's the timeline they should be thinking about to get some kind of indication as to where things are going? Would you expect in the next 2 years that things could change in a significant way? 5 years, 10 years, 50 years?
No, so the way I think about this, I mean, one marker, I spent a long time researching and ultimately writing a piece on political evolution in China. And in effect what that piece said was that, in my judgment, sometime in the 5th generation of leadership, the Chinese, since the revolution, first generation was Mao, second generation was Deng Xiaoping, third was Jiang Zemin, fourth is the current leadership Hu Jintao. So the 5th generation, i.e. the next leaders who come into power in 2012, and then they're in power for 10 years. So from 2012 to 2022, my piece on political evolution essentially said, my guess is sometime in that time period, we'll start to get a clearer sense of where political evolution is really going. And wherever it's going, it'll be distinctly Chinese, but it'll trend towards a Western democratic model. I think in parallel with that will be issues like this question of spirituality. It'll be there for two reasons. One, because I think the leadership will see that spirituality can be a congealing force, not necessarily a force which works against the stability of the state. It can be a congealing force, and also a force in some ways that can moderate other more potentially pernicious issues like nationalism, like unbridled nationalism, which the Chinese think always have to be on guard for. So I think they will realize that, and I think also they'll just generally become increasingly pluralistic and recognize that's part of the texture of a 21st century society, and that's a good thing. And so I think in there will be this, is one to watch for this. But there will not be, in my judgment anyway, there won't be a kind of a time where it goes from, where you turn on a light switch, it goes from dark to light. It'll just sort of be slowly coming out of the ether.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your insights, and for participating in the seminar. Once again, I'm Joel Podolny and have had the pleasure to have a conversation with John Thornton. Thank you.
Thank you.